Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council weekly online briefing for faith leaders. Today's topic is focused on COVID-19's impact on foundation giving and the nonprofits that they support. Hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and it's supported by the Joint Information Center of the San Francisco COVID Command Center. Some housekeeping for today. Audio, video, and chat will be monitored and recorded for record keeping, training, and quality assurance. By default, all participants will be muted and video turned off to minimize distractions. To submit a question or comment, select the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to Q&A. They will be shared with the speakers and panelists after the meeting for response. Thank you so much. San Francisco is still experiencing a dangerous COVID-19 surge. You can take the following actions in order to save lives. Stay home as much as you can. Avoid gathering with people from outside your household, whether indoors or outdoors. When you must go out, make sure to wear a mask. 1 in 3 people with COVID have no symptoms but can infect other people without knowing it. If you have been exposed to COVID-19 or have symptoms, follow guidelines about quarantining. Support is available by calling 628-217-6101 or by calling 311. Together, we will recover. Get tested, San Francisco. You can save lives and stop the spread of COVID-19 by getting tested through your healthcare provider. If you have symptoms or have been exposed to COVID-19, but don't have health insurance or can't get tested through your provider, visit sf.gov/gettestedsf or call 311 for information on getting tested at a city-run testing location. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you to our wonderful COVID Command Center, Joint Information Center Virtual Outreach team. This is our 37th program, and we are very grateful for the ongoing commitment and providing this platform. Good morning, I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this week's online briefing for faith leaders. COVID has impacted all aspects of life in the Bay Area. Funders are responding in new ways to meet the needs of their grantees, collaborating and creating new grant-making opportunities, increasing their payouts, addressing racial injustice in COVID response, and reaching out to communities they haven't funded previously. In this week's online briefing for faith leaders hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and supported by the COVID Command Center's Joint Information Center Virtual Outreach team, we'll hear from 2 grant makers about the impact COVID has had on philanthropy. They'll discuss how their foundations have responded, what they are seeing happening with the hundreds of organizations their foundations support, and what they anticipate happening in 2021. Without further ado, I would like to introduce friend and colleague, Kaushik Roy, the chairman of the San Francisco Interfaith Council and executive director of the Shanti Project, to bring greetings from our board and to read the interfaith statement.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the board, it is my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all of you this morning. Thank you for joining us. On a personal note, I am particularly excited about this week's conversation. In fact, over the weekend, there was a new book released in which the author, Houston Kraft, makes a fairly startling suggestion that kindness isn't normal anymore. Kindness isn't normal. And I don't know if this is similar for any of you, but when I first heard that or read that, I kind of recoiled a bit inside. Of course, kindness is normal. How could we live in a world where kindness isn't normal? But as the author goes on to write, an objective mind would at least entertain the possibility. And I share that because the city of St. Francis, once again, over the last 11 months, has been able to lead the response towards the pandemic with kindness. And one of the main reasons we can do that is because we are blessed to have so many incredible foundations like the ones that are represented here this morning. So I want to give a special thanks to Stephanie and Elena and let them know all the nonprofits here appreciate all the support and partnerships you've had with us over the years. I also want to give a special thank you to our 2-member staff who accomplished the work of staffs much larger than them. Michael Pappas and Cynthia Sambucas are incredible in what they do, and they continue to take on more responsibilities and continue to fulfill them really, really effectively. So on behalf of the board, we know how fortunate we are to have Michael and Cynthia leading the charge. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, I want to extend a special welcome to you. I hope you will join us again, and this won't be your last time joining us. At the beginning of every interfaith event or meeting, we do have a council interfaith statement we like to read. It's just a way to take a moment to ground ourselves and remind us why we're all gathered here this morning. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. Good morning, everybody.
Thank you, Kaushik, and thank you for your continued leadership and commitment to joining us every week. You have been a stellar board chair, and we extend our appreciation to you. At this time, I would like to introduce a very special soul, a dear friend and colleague, Miguel Bustos. Miguel is no stranger to philanthropy, but he is at this point in life, he is the Social Justice Director, Senior Director for Social Justice at Glide, and a candidate for ordination with the Episcopal Diocese of California in their diaconate program. Miguel brings kindness and goodness wherever he goes, and I thought that it would be wonderful to ground us today in a reflective moment by seeing him and hearing his words. Miguel?
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Kaushik, for your leadership. This is a great opportunity for me to be with all of you, especially during this time. And I want us to lean in a little bit. And, you know, we're family, we're familia, and we're kin. And I want us to lean together and close our eyes and ask our Creator for help. Oh, Creator, the great mystery of many beautiful names, we ask that you be here with us as you were with our ancestors and be a pillar within our midst. Help us turn to you, O Holy One, for guidance during these troubled times. Give us strength for the weeks and months ahead. Give solace to those who grieve the loss of those who have died due to COVID. We lift our concerns for people who are most likely to become ill, especially the elderly, people with chronic health conditions, those that must go into a workplace every day and that are put at risk. Protect them from harm and be their comfort during this time of uncertainty, and for many, this time of isolation. O great Spirit, as people get sick, healthcare workers and first responders are working longer hours with fewer supplies and are more at risk in contracting the new strains of the coronavirus. Renew their energy and sustain them on these long shifts. Bring your protection upon them so as they work with patients, they are safe. Inspire and invigorate the researchers and doctors who are developing tests, diagnosing the new strains, creating more vaccine, and understanding better protocols to eliminate this widespread disease, not just here in San Francisco, but throughout the world. O Spirit, Be with people making decisions that affect the lives of the futures of our family, our communities, our countries, and the world. May they communicate clearly, truthfully, and calmly with each other and with the public. And may the messages be heard and heeded. May truth and empathy be the touchstone of people setting policies for our protection. May our community leaders and organizations be sustained by your mercy, O Spirit. As community organizations have been forced to pivot to meet these unique challenges, may their supporters continue to provide the resources in creative ways to match those that are suffering with the services and help available. And beautiful God, help our faith leaders with a humble spirit by helping them understand their strengths and weaknesses as leaders during this time. Help inspire them to think creatively about how they engage, care, and protect their communities as they navigate reopening buildings. Help them remember that when they forget to care for themselves as they care for others, that their faith community needs them now and will need them later. Help them lean on your strength and wisdom as they seek to lead their communities during these unprecedented times. Great mystery, be our still waters when we are surrounded by fear and anxiety. Be our rock whom we can turn and give our worries and fears. Be our shelter. Guide our steps and keep us safe. And help us feel your presence in these times of change. Now, as we do a glide after every prayer, I'm going to ask you to repeat after me. Amen.
Amen.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Right on.
Right on.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Salam.
Salam.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Bless you, Miguel. I can't think of a better way to start this program. It is with great humility that I invite our two featured presenters to step forward. Those of us who are in the nonprofit world realize that we could not be doing what we're doing without the financial support of foundations like the San Francisco Foundation and the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. As I transitioned the council from a volunteer organization to being its first executive director, I can tell you for the past 14 years, we have been so grateful to these two foundations in particular for their ongoing support, not just their ongoing support, but their engagement with us. The San Francisco through its Faiths program and the Walter and Elise Haas Fund through Stephanie's particular engagement with us on the number of issues and programs that they fund. We are very grateful also when COVID hit, that these two foundations and so many others came forward unsolicited and offered rapid response funding, realizing the impact COVID was going to have on nonprofits like ours. I think that this is a very important program, and I'm so pleased to see the number of participants and attendees that are with us thus far. And without further ado, I want to extend a greeting to both Elena Chavez Quesada, Vice President of Programs for the San Francisco Foundation, as well as Stephanie Rapp, the Senior Program Officer for the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. The floor is yours. Do with the next 20, 30 minutes as you please and illuminate us.
Thank you, Michael. It's really an honor to be with everybody this morning. And it's also an honor to have a job where we get to support community organizations that are really doing the heavy lift. I mean, philanthropy often gets a lot of accolades and appreciation, but at the end of the day, it's our job to support all of you and those of you on the call because you're doing the really hard work of keeping people healthy and safe. So I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. We're a family foundation that was started by the descendants of Levi Strauss And since 1952, we have supported organizations in San Francisco and Alameda around a variety of topics: public education, economic security, safety net, which is food and shelter, disaster preparedness, and then the program I run, which is a Jewish Life program, which is really about faith-based justice. We allocate about $11 million a year to 350 organizations that really are about giving opportunities for people to thrive. And most of our grantees are secular, but we have worked very closely with communities of faith on safety net, on disaster, and through SF Card in particular, in the Interfaith Council. And then my program, which really is about combating all forms of bigotry, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, and to bring communities of faith together around economic and social justice for all. And in the last couple of years, sadly, we've had to sort of lean into some of that work before COVID around fighting hatred and disinformation, both on the internet and in life. We're a small staff of 9, and our board is made up of family members. And I think now Elena, who I'm so happy is on this call, because she and I had the great privilege of working together for several years at the same foundation, and are now colleagues, and we enjoy each other's company very much. So she's also going to talk a bit about SF Foundation, and then we're going to start to talk about COVID, and hopefully this will be a kind of conversation between 2 colleagues and friends. So Elena.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the San Francisco Interfaith Council, to all of you for being here, for the invitation. As Stephanie said, we're old colleagues and friends, and it's really wonderful and such an honor to be on the panel today, and look forward to hearing from the other amazing leaders that are going to be speaking in a bit. So my name is Elena Chavez Quesada. I'm the Vice President of Programs at the San Francisco Foundation. We are a community foundation serving the 5-county Bay Area, and just kind of a very high level view of the foundation is our North Star is really around racial equity and economic inclusion. When our CEO, Fred Blackwell, came to the foundation 5 years ago, it was not that we weren't focused on racial equity, but we kind of honed into it to a different level and said, when we talk about issues of housing, jobs, any kind of economic opportunity, it's impossible to not think about race. And so we made an explicit commitment to put that at the center. And we think about it in several different ways, racial equity and economic inclusion. One is about economic opportunity for low-income communities of color. And we address that through building worker power, building community wealth, decriminalizing poverty, the housing crisis in the Bay Area, which I'm sure is front and center for so many of us on the call, if not all of us, is also a huge priority for us, both at a policy level. We look at local, regional, and state housing policy, but also at a very kind of direct community level when we look at the massive numbers of evictions that are happening and that we're bracing ourselves for as our economy recovers. So, and then finally, I think the thread that runs through all of our work is movement building and power building. And so we are very proud to support the grassroots community leaders who are at the forefront of engaging with community and ensuring that community has a voice. And so this is, I think, a really important topic, and I wanted to just kind of frame what Stephanie and I will talk about today to say this is a real opportunity. With crisis, of course, comes opportunity. And I think it has been a real chance for philanthropy to think about what we need to be doing differently. And so Stephanie and I will talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that's one of the themes that we'll highlight in our conversation today.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm going to take us back now for a minute as we start to talk about how COVID has impacted philanthropy. You know, it was February 6th, so almost exactly a year ago, that we had the first death for COVID in the US in Santa Clara. And philanthropy, as most of us weren't really thinking that much about the global impact and how this was going to affect the Bay Area, but we had some kind of, our antennas were up a bit. And in March, we began, I think all of us, to recognize that COVID was going to be a huge impact in the Bay Area. And we began to survey our grantees on March 13th. And even that early, we saw that 80% of grantees had to start canceling events, particularly fundraising events. And there was a lot of concern about how, sadly, nonprofits depend upon events as one way to get revenue. We saw that organizations had to reduce programming. And within a few weeks, it was clear that everybody was scrambling to figure out how to deliver their services. They couldn't necessarily rely on the volunteers that the corporate community has provided, and then had to hire staff. There were a lot of our grantees were saying they were really concerned about getting information. Like, how do they find out if they're eligible for the payroll protection grants? How do they get PPE and the kind of equipment they need to keep their staff safe? The public schools, SF and OUSD, closed in March, which meant 90,000 or so students were going to be deprived not only of education, but of healthy meals, because the school districts are huge providers of food meals. And of course, that meant parents didn't have childcare and all of the attendant fallout from that. So in hearing what our grantees needed early on, we recognized that we wanted to provide them with information. And so, as Michael mentioned, we gave grants to a couple of nonprofits, including the Interfaith Council, to begin to get information to folks. Including Eden INR, because we realized people who depend on safety net were not sure whether food was going to be available to them, whether shelter was. We provided grants to organizations to help organizations do financial planning. Like, how do you determine if you have to furlough your staff, if you have to let people go? How do you do any kind of scenario planning with so much uncertainty? So helping our grantees get access to expert resources was one of the first things that we did. And then providing money early on for just the most basic needs. We gave some quick response grants to our safety net organizations to get more food out to the community. We gave money to the school districts to figure out ways to get food to students who weren't coming in every day for their meals. And then we joined some pooled funds so that we could help individuals who typically are left out of government response. I mean, there was the CARES Act that was providing money, but if you were undocumented, you were not eligible. Working artists were not eligible. So we supported some pooled funds with some of our partners to make that kind of support available to individuals, as well as loans to small businesses and nonprofits. And then we really recognized early on too that mental health was going to be a challenge for young people. We heard that from the students in the school districts that we support. And so we got early on some mental health support for youth. So those were kind of the very early days from our perspective. How about for you guys, Elena?
Yeah, I think having the survey and kind of learning early on was so important, and many of our colleagues, I think we were trying to learn from each other, so we weren't burdening you all so much, and so it was really wonderful to have the leadership of the Haas Senior Fund and gathering some of that information that we could all learn from. And I think that the main response that we had at the very beginning, and I'll talk about the funding response certainly, but as a community foundation in particular, and as any foundation, I think our responsibility is to listen. And so we're in philanthropy, we're not kind of at the ground level responding to the need. And so we took a lot of time at the beginning to just listen. And there's so much I could say about that, but I do want to just highlight kind of a personal / professional moment that happened where we had already convened a bunch of Latino leaders across the Bay Area to talk about housing. And this was really an important meeting for us in shaping our housing policy agenda and making sure it was grounded in the experience of communities that we were seeking to support. And we repurposed the conversation entirely because things had just shut down, people were in crisis, and just kind of opened it up for general reflections on how these incredible community leaders were doing. And it really floored all of us, the leadership from Blackwell. We were all on the call, and I think for the rest of my life will remember that call, that moment, as the moment where I knew we would never be the same after this experience. And afterwards, after the call, when the foundation staff kind of regrouped, I just kind of named the grief that we were kind of flooded with at that moment. And every member of the leadership team started to cry. And I just, I say that because I think, you know, the listening can, when we really listen, can hit so hard, and you can really open yourselves up, and that can change the trajectory of what you do. We launched a COVID-19 emergency response fund that was kind of built on the infrastructure of a rapid response fund for movement building that we started in 2016. And the good thing about that is it established a nimble process. So philanthropy is not known for the nimbleness, I know, but we were very proud of this rapid response fund that did have a very quick turnaround, as the name suggests. And so we built the emergency response fund on top of that to really address issues of food security, housing and homelessness, protecting workers, and addressing the very disturbing kind of racial bias and targeting that was happening at the onset of the pandemic, and sadly is continuing to happen to this day. So that was some of the emergency response fund we had. We also kind of had some disaster grants that we had teed up years and years ago with our board. So in the event of a disaster, we would get these grants out really quickly to this set of organizations who would be at the front lines. Nobody thought it would be a pandemic. We all thought it would be an earthquake. So deployed those funds. We've recently gotten approval to, and we'll talk more about this because I think that the racial justice component is really important, to have increased our spending by $10 million over the next few years. So we're trying to kind of leverage all of our resources to meet the need. And I just wanted to have a special kind of mention of the faith community, because as we all know, the faith community has always been the first responders and the ones ready to kind of meet the need. And there has been no deviation from that as we think about all of the crises that we have right now. We're very proud of our faiths program, which many of you know, the leadership of Tessa Callejo over the years and Michelle Myers-Chambers, and really relied on the deep connections with the faith community to get additional resources out. So when the food banks were overwhelmed, when the larger food pantries that were meeting, you know, the need were just overwhelmed, it was the faith community who was at the front line. So we've been very excited to be able to support that. And then the last thing I'll just say as another little anecdote is, you know, we think about resources and funding, and I know that's paramount, but the other thing, and Stephanie, you alluded to this, was mental health, and just really concerned about the toll this is taking on community largely, but also all of the leaders that are there trying to keep things going. And so we offered a series of mindfulness trainings offered by one of our grantees, the Mindful Life Project, just to say, you know what, once a week, and we're going to start those up again, Wellness Wednesdays, once a week, have a moment to kind of step back and take care of yourself.
Yeah, and I think your point about faith communities as first responders is true. I mean, always in disasters, and as you said, I think many of us who work around disaster preparedness, which Haas does, we think about earthquakes increasingly. We've been thinking about climate-driven disasters. And of course, during all of this shelter in place, we had the week of orange skies and horrible air quality, which of course, again, has a different impact depending on what community you live in, whether you're housed or unhoused. But I do want to share a slide, and maybe we can do this now, that just looks at where things were. And this is around August that we really started to see some pretty terrible numbers. So hopefully folks can kind of get in a little closer, you might be able to see, but we know that COVID had a disparate impact on communities of color, both in terms of people more likely to get it because of being frontline workers, public-facing jobs, as living in houses with many people, and not having the access to healthcare to mean that their outcomes were not going to be as good. 66% of essential workers in the Bay Area are people of color, 44% are immigrants. By August, 1 in 3 Californians had applied for unemployment assistance. We had 2,000 businesses closed. For food, the demand was crazy. And we were really seeing this with our safety net organizations. An additional 28,000 people were looking for food from the San Francisco and Marin Food Bank per week. We had half of low-income California renters not able to pay their next month's rent. And, sadly, if you look at the fact that in the first week of shelter in place, you had 32,000 students in SFUSD logged in. By the second week, only 16,000 had, right? Which speaks to internet access, but it also speaks to the sort of mental health toll that this was having. And then of course, shelter in placement, people, schools are a place that students have access to caring adults as well as mandated reporters. And so we know that domestic violence increased during shelter in place. And we saw that in the first week, 60% increase in calls to the SFDA around domestic violence. So it was a horrible time in the summer. I think we all remember that, and we could take the slide down. And so at that point, keeping people housed, I think, was one of the things that really mattered to the fund. And we know that even though government, there's this sort of, people talk about public-private partnerships, about the role of government and philanthropy being kind of complementary. And we certainly rely on government to create policies that help our most vulnerable. So there was, some CARES money for people, but lots of folks not eligible. There was a moratorium on evictions, meaning government recognized people might not be able to pay their rent because of COVID, but that money is due at some point. And we put $1 million into for organizations for rental relief so that folks do not get so far behind in their rent that when it ultimately does come due, they're not going to be able to pay it. So, it's really, as Elena said, sort of listening and hearing what folks are facing. And I will also say it's kind of overwhelming. I mean, the mental health toll on our grantees, we feel that. I think for Elena and I and a lot of folks in philanthropy, we do it because these are communities we care deeply about. And we started to talk about our situation as not working from home, but living at work. And we gave out our cell numbers, which I've always been sort of happy to do with some of my grantees, but now like my cell number is on our webpage and we want people to call. And we have some grantees on different time zones. And so, getting calls at different hours of the day. But I think for me, and I'd love to know, Leonard, for you, I just feel so much more connected to my grantees. And I've been doing this for 17 years. And not that there's any upside of what we've gone through, but I will say finding those human connections has been really sustaining for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I mean, that slide that you have really puts, that seeing the numbers is always so shocking, and to see the numbers of with all of these different issue areas is really stark. And absolutely, I think that's why it's so wonderful to be with you all in community today. I think the human connection is the most important, and that's why I shared that story about talking to those Latinx leaders, because wow, you know, to look someone in the eye who says, I may have to lay off 203 staff tomorrow because our contracts with the school district are ending. I mean, it gets real. I'll also just say, you know, talking to folks who at this point are unable to get their unemployment insurance claims processed. And, you know, in a time of great crisis, I think we have the front line, like immediate response, but this also gives us a chance to look at our deep, deep systemic inequities. And there is no coincidence that the people who have suffered, who are disproportionately suffering at this moment, are Black and Brown communities. And so I think, you know, one thing Stephanie and I feel very passionately about, and our foundations have really responded to, is, you know, we have a moment of racial reckoning in this country. And when you look at the disparate impacts of the pandemic on communities of color, there's no more kind of walking, you can't not see it. It's so front and center. And we look at, you know, Stephanie, you were talking about some of the public assistance programs that have come out, but you know, the disparate, the way that different communities are able to access that. For example, you know, the undocumented immigrant community completely shut out of many of those benefits. And we know that the Latinx community is one of the ones most disproportionately impacted. So I think, yes, absolutely, like keeping a human connection to that, and then seeing how all of these issues are interconnected, and perhaps that is the silver lining, that it jolts people into a reality check about, you know, it is no coincidence that the data looks the way it does. There is no coincidence that we are watching our families suffer, and so that's something I wanted to just raise, and I think will be kind of a long-term theme for both of our foundations as we think about how we respond both on the direct service element, you know, how can we get people food? How can we keep people housed? But then look at the deep systemic inequities that have led to these challenges to begin with.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. And I mean, of course, during, you know, 2020 was just such a year. I mean, it's kind of hard to go back and remember, not just the beginnings of COVID and the impact of the wildfires and climate change that we know is going to become part of our annual. And then, of course, you know, the murders of so many Black people at the hands of the police, the racism and hatred that came out against communities early on. It was against the Asian community, as you know, pandemics often bring this kind of need to scapegoat, and what was happening on the national scale. And so it was really, we also have begun to do some internal work. I think a lot of organizations are. But one of the things that have changed, not only how we are thinking about whether we're responding enough to communities of color, and we've done a round of grant making to Black-led organizations just at the end of the year, and really beginning to look deeply at who we're funding and are we funding enough communities of color and the most vulnerable, but how philanthropy shifted. And you and I, Elena, talked about this the other day. Like, there have been some things that we're doing because of COVID that we should be doing maybe as practice, right? Like, we've asked grantees in many cases, they don't have to send a written report. We can have a phone call. And that also deepens a bond. Like, you learn more in talking to somebody, and you can come in with an inquiring mind as opposed to you know, reading something is a very sort of flat thing. So we really thought about, are we responding quick enough when we're not in COVID times? Are we asking, we're trying to take on some of that burden. We look up 501c3 information ourselves instead of asking grantees to submit it. And I imagine you all have begun to make grants in different ways that maybe you'll be able to hang on to.
That's the hope, Stephanie. I think, like I said, wake up call in so many ways. And I think a real wake up call for philanthropy and how we can do things better. And we exist with an enormous contradiction, right? The very spirit of philanthropy, the reason why we exist, it's built on the wealth accumulation, often on the backs of the people that the communities we're trying to help. So let's first acknowledge the past and understand that as we move forward. I think one of the headlines that we've been talking a lot about is like, going back to normal is not good. Like, where we were before was actually really bad for so many families and communities here in the Bay Area. And so, you know, as we move forward, getting back to normal is not good enough. I think we have a chance to redefine what true economic inclusion looks like. And so, you know, from the way that we do grant making, and Stephanie, just like the conversational reporting, that's huge for our sector. And I think it is a move towards a fundamental concept and movement spearheaded by the Whitman Institute years ago called trust-based philanthropy, where one of our main responsibilities as funders is to disrupt the power dynamics that exist in these relationships and to serve with humility and to listen. And so that's really what my hope is for our one sector, Stephanie and I. It's been wonderful to see, especially like for smaller foundations, how you can be more nimble and make those changes. And then the call to larger foundations to really do what needs to be done to shift practices more broadly. So it's exciting.
Yeah, and let's hope that shifts. And I think now we can have an opportunity to hear from some of the organizations that our foundations fund and how COVID's impacted them. And then I guess they're going to ask us some questions.
Thank you to you both. I mean, you have painted a very comprehensive picture that is perfect in terms of setting the table for what's to come next. As you mentioned, we've, in order to create the whole picture, we thought we would bring in grantees so that they could talk about how they have been impacted both as organizations and raising funds in the midst of COVID. And they are from three very different foundations, three very different nonprofits. We're going to begin with Reverend Dr. Jonathan Butler, the Executive Director of the San Francisco African American Faith-Based Coalition. And in introducing Reverend Dr. Butler, I would just say that around Passover and Easter, Mayor Breed had asked me to come and speak at one of her press briefings. There was a concern about folks, flocking to congregations for services. And I used the opportunity really to commend our faith leaders because the funding we have received from our foundations has enabled us to get out information in real time so faith leaders can make informed decisions on behalf of their congregants to keep them safe and protected. And that was the message I got out there, how this information enabled them to pivot very quickly. When I descended from the stage, though, I realized that this is really a tale of two cities, that those congregations that had the resources had made the pivot easily to online services and virtual ministry. But those who did not were suffering. And it was at that point that I reached out to my friend Veronica Shepard, also from the African American Faith-Based Coalition. And we began conversations on how the council could be of greater support in this issue of equity. We are very thrilled to have Reverend Dr. Butler with us. And with that, Reverend Butler, would you kind of give us, paint a picture for us how your organization has been impacted, and then ask a question of our featured presenters.
Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Pappas, and to the Interfaith Council, and to everyone who has gathered. I am certainly excited about the conversation that's been had, and I want to talk a little bit about the San Francisco African American Faith-Based Coalition and our work during the pandemic. So first, the coalition is comprised of 21 churches that's scattered around San Francisco. We've been working prior to COVID. Obviously, COVID has enhanced our work a little bit. Our mission has simply been to mobilize San Francisco and its resources to eliminate health disparities, particularly in the Black and African American community. It started by Veronica Shepard with churches in the Bayview, but since our work, we've been adding churches throughout San Francisco. We've been dealing with food security. Food security has been a major concern prior to COVID. And obviously everyone knows it's sort of amplified just as it did during the Great Recession. It may even be worse than that. So we have been working since March to address this issue. A lot of our community members are worried that they would run out of food before they had money to buy more. A lot of them can't afford to eat a balanced meal. Many of them have had to cut the size of their meals or even skip meals. A lot of our community is comprised of, as a matter of fact, a little bit under 50% of our community is comprised of seniors. We have a lot of community members that are living in multiple generational households, as a matter of fact, 75%. And then, as we all know, again, prior to COVID, a lot of our community have been burdened by chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, even asthma and kidney failure. And, but I think one thing to note about our community is not only do we serve members of the congregations from those churches, but the surrounding members that are in the neighborhoods of those congregations. So 70% or 76% of our community is, we service African Americans, but we do serve 12% Latinx and about 5% Asian as well. And we've been able to assess specifically what the needs are via survey, just to make sure that we're on the right track. And so one of the questions that we've asked is, what would you say your biggest concern about money is right now? And the top two things are food and rent and mortgage. So what we've been able to do as a consequence is, and I think this is certainly important, is collaboration. So there are many partners that we've collaborated with, particularly the Marion Foodbank, San Francisco New Deal, Earls Organics, We Together SF, UCSF, SFDPH. That is the success of our business model, or if you will, our coalition model, is everybody has to come together to do this work. And I think what's most important, obviously, is the financial resources. So we are really appreciative of foundations such as the San Francisco Foundation, who's been able to allow the process to be very, very smooth and easy for us. I mean, they realize that we've been doing the work and all we do is just need the resources. And as a consequence of that, we to date have been able to deliver 220,000 meals since March. And then also, we also distribute produce boxes in the amount of 22,000 since March. And, our strengths are local collaboration. We have a delivery model. So because we're dealing with seniors and it's best for them to shelter in place, we've been delivering food to them. And that's been certainly a benefit for us, and perhaps maybe the reason why the numbers in the African-American community are down as it relates to COVID in San Francisco. But obviously there are barriers. And at the top of the list is we've been privileged to have a lot of foundations that have seen our work and have funded our work. But now it's about sustainability, because this issue will not leave us. And we need to make sure that not only we address food security, but there's other issues that the coalition would like to address. At the top of that is mental health and education. So I think my question would be, and you sort of alluded to it earlier, it's all about relationships for us, and particularly for me. And so how do we approach foundations, particularly those foundations that haven't had a history of providing funds to our community. How do we build that successful grantee-funder relationship? What are some of the things that we initially need to do to ensure that?
You want to start, Stephanie?
Yeah, I can take just a minute. I mean, I will say there's often a little trepidation, maybe is the right word, for some funders in funding communities of faith. So I think it's really important to recognize that there may be a little hesitancy, but at the end of the day, what funders want are to reach vulnerable people. And I think being able to talk about your work, just as you said here, the number of folks that you delivered meals to, the fact that you're polling people, you actually have information about communities that would be helpful to us. We're really trying to learn about, look, we know who our grantees serve, but we don't know so many of the organizations that are reaching people that maybe aren't on our radar and should be. So I think right now, maybe more than ever before, there's really an openness on the part of philanthropy to hear from smaller nonprofits that are serving communities that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of COVID. And many of us, like I said earlier, you know, my cell number is on my, you can reach me pretty easily. And I think a lot of us right now want to hear from organizations that we don't know. Do you agree, Elena?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Reverend Butler. Thank you for asking it. And I think I actually spoke about this yesterday, and I will say, I think a lot of the responsibility also lies with funders to create more openness. So I appreciate your question, but I also want to challenge funders to create more openings for community to come in, to increase our knowledge of the grassroots communities, maybe perhaps the small nonprofits that might be overlooked, so that we can build that relationship and to, you know, have a relationship, but where we can respectfully, you know, where organizations can respectfully challenge philanthropy to do more with faith communities. I have heard a little bit of momentum of foundations recognizing the importance of the faith community. So I feel like that's a really positive sign. And the other thing I would suggest is, you know, for the funders that you currently have, ask them to help introduce you to other funders. Sometimes I think that's a big part of our role. We all, you know, work at these institutions that will never make a dent in the issues we're trying to solve by ourselves. So, you know, I would ask your funders to sit down with you, look at your pipeline of foundations you're trying to reach, and see if they'd be willing to help with any introductions.
Thank you both. And thank you for that wonderful question and your presentation, Reverend Dr. Butler. I mentioned in introducing our two presenters that their particular foundations have taken a unique interest in the programs and missions of the nonprofits they fund. One of the other things that I have found over the years is that both Walter and Elise Haas and the San Francisco Foundation have tried to build relationships among grantees. And in particular, in our work around issues of disaster preparedness. We are very blessed to have with us today Heather Lee, the program manager for San Francisco CARD, Community Agencies Responding to Disaster. We have worked because one of the founding missions of the Interfaith Council is disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. We've worked with Heather and SF CARD on a number of disaster-related issues. And at this point, I know that you've had some exciting times during COVID. Heather, would you take the floor and share with us your experience and the experience of SF CARD?
Find my mute button. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for the introduction. I sit around and ponder my introduction, and you always take care of it for me. I want to start by saying it's really nice to meet you, Stephanie. I hear your name a lot. And just, I want to personally say thank you to the Haas Fund for the last grant that we got from the Haas Fund that said, you know, basically go figure yourselves out, like work on your strategic mission. It's been a very interesting year to work on a strategic mission, I've got to say. But one of the things that came out of that was exploring other funding opportunities. And we spent the last year and some working with a state grant from California, Cal OES, Office of Emergency Services, with the Listos grant. By now, a lot of people have heard about the Listos grant, and I've been on this call a couple of times talking about the Listos grant. When COVID happened, we found ourselves with this grant money that was for in-person personal preparedness, which was already an interesting stretch for us because we are in fact an organization that supports organizations in their preparedness, response, and recovery around disaster. And so with COVID taking that funding, I often call myself the branch office of Cal OES Grants Management, because we took that opportunity, and because every crisis is also an opportunity. We really took that opportunity with that funding and decided, how are we going to spread this as broadly as possible? How are we going to help organizations? You know, we are so cognizant in what we do, things like the number of organizations that don't survive. Like, this is our bread and butter, is how do we help organizations survive disaster? And so I've been so blessed, hair pulling and blessed simultaneously in having this funding to be able to help organizations. I want to give a huge shout out to UCHS, United Council of Human Services. I originally approached them about the Listos program before COVID, and they, like many organizations, said, I don't know, there's a lot of strings to that government money. And then after COVID, they were one of so many organizations that were like, okay, let's broaden our ideas. And we worked with them all year, all through 2020. I'm super proud of the work that we did. I hope the state's super proud of the work that we did in making that information available to people and helping those organizations do that support work that needed to happen. I'm looking forward to continuing to utilize government money in what we do, but there are a lot of strings attached to that money, as I am learning, because this has been a learning process for me. And my own particular niche in an SF card is from the faith-based perspective. As probably everybody's heard by now, I used to be a minister in the Episcopal Church. And so I bring that knowledge, that, you know, I've been there knowledge to the work. And I think what I'm curious about in terms of foundation funding isn't about addressing specifically COVID, but all the things that are still happening besides COVID. You know, what about that work that still needs to happen that isn't? Like, I'm gonna pitch two things that just sit on my heart all the time that I'm always trying to figure out how we can handle. One is a collaboration I have with Interfaith Power and Light around combating global warming and climate justice. And disaster, you know, there's a disaster component to that. Like, we have these great ideas, but we don't know how to get them funded. Another one I wonder about is, Michael, do you remember way back a long, long time ago in 2019, and we did the congregational security workshop. And I'm so grateful. I still have the huge folder. I have all of this research that I did, all of these interested congregations that weren't even there reached out to me afterwards. How can we do this? but you know, it's the funding to continue that work, and especially with COVID, the funding, you know, at the organizational level to support someone like me to come in and do that work. You know, there's the broad-based training that we can bring everybody together and have a high-level discussion about it, but there's also the support in that, the granular work, the what does this particular congregation need to know? What are those special answers that they have that aren't, oh, you know, that needs a phone call. That doesn't need another workshop. The answer is too small. So I'm just wondering with foundations, how do we approach these other activities that still are important, that still need to be done, and they're not the latest greatest.
Yeah, that's a great question, Heather. And I mean, look, the truth is, I would say all the foundations I'm aware of, while we've made very big pivots towards COVID, putting extra money out, doing rapid response, we still continue our regular grant making. So, you know, we've been funding disaster preparedness for, I don't know, 13, 14 years. And for SF card for most of that time. We try to stick with grantees for a long time. And I think, you know, again, COVID has opened up people's minds, funders too, about what does disaster mean? And so I think there is an opportunity, you know, it used to be just earthquake, and then it was, you know, maybe earthquake plus climate. And we've expanded our definition to include, sadly, things like mass shootings and attacks on houses of worship is part of our disaster preparedness now. And so I think there's never going to be a more receptive time to speak to funders about resiliency of communities, and whether that's resiliency for a pandemic or an earthquake or any other disaster. I think you'd have an opening. And on the climate, you know, we're starting to really think, and again, this year with those horrible orange skies, I think reminded funders who do care about equity that climate disasters fall on communities very differently. We know that it can be in Pacific Heights and it can be 75 degrees, and you can be in Bayview and it can be 92, and you can have seniors really suffering because there's so much concrete and lack of shade. And so we've started to fund an organization called Dayenu, which is the Jewish response or Jewish call to climate action. Dayenu meaning like enough, like we've had enough. And part of that is to bring together different communities of faith around the climate action table. So I'd be happy, you know, offline to share some thoughts about funders I know that are starting to think about it, but I don't think funders have walked away from kind of non-COVID work. And I also think funders are starting to think about climate and disasters a little differently because of the events of the last few years.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Heather. In the spirit of full disclosure, I wanted to just share that the San Francisco Interfaith Council was a subcontractor, if you will, for the Listos program. And we did not realize what doors that would open. And I share this only because I know that in my conversations with Stephanie and Tessa, one of the things that funders want to see is they want to see us be able to grow in our capacity and in our relationships with other funders. What we did not realize, and I shared this with Heather just the other day, was that because we were a subcontractor at Listos, that we were eligible for yet another grant contract with another Sierra Health organization, which is being funded to do outreach on all things related COVID. We would not have had that eligibility had we not been a subcontractor for Listos. And so that opened up all unique doors. We would not have had that eligibility had Walter and Elise Haas and the San Francisco Foundation not encouraged the relationship between our two organizations. So once again, thank you for these sort of interesting ancillary things that you do. Our final but not the least of which is the Islamic Networks Group. The Islamic Networks Group is a long-time organization that the San Francisco Interfaith Council has had a relationship with. We're glad to have with us today Ishak Pathan, who is the Bay Area Director. They're doing some amazing work, but we'd like to call upon Ishak if he could share with us how ING has been impacted, and then of course, ask a question of our featured presenters.
Great, well, thank you all so much, and thanks to the San Francisco Interfaith Council and to the foundations represented here, as well as the panelists and everyone on the call for being here. So I'll talk a little bit about ING before going into how we've had to adapt during COVID and where that has led our funding to go. So we're a peace building organization, and we mainly provide face-to-face education and engagement to foster understanding of Muslims and other misunderstood groups, mainly to promote harmony among everyone. And for the last 28 years, we've provided face-to-face presentations and panels to diverse venues from middle and high schools to colleges, universities, as well as houses of worship and community organizations. And we've also been engaged in interfaith dialogue and promote religious literacy through our interfaith panels and other forums. And over the last few years, we've actually become a little bit more involved in anti-racism education through programs where we convene people from marginalized groups to talk about the history of dominant narratives and their impact on the quality of life for people in those groups and communities. And all of these programs have traditionally been delivered face-to-face, which we believe is the most powerful way to counter stereotypes. But with the advent of COVID-19, we really had to shift gears and learn how to convene our programs online. And we realized that education is considered essential and the demand for our educational programming only grew. And so utilizing online platforms like Zoom and Facebook Live, we were able to meet the needs of others while also hosting our own events, which enabled us to reach twice as many people this year than the year before, going from 1 million to 2 million people. And with the advent of shelter in place that began in March, we really started to see and receive the support of several foundations who reached out from both the South Bay and San Francisco, including the ones on the call, the San Francisco Foundation and the Walter and Elise Haas Fund, to ask if we needed immediate funding. And we felt that they responded, for us at least, in a few different ways, including taking our existing grants and eliminating reporting, and also in some cases converting them from project funds to general operating funds, which reduced, which allowed us to keep the money and utilize that money in the best way possible for the organization at the time. For grants that we were promised money in the future, other foundations had sped up that timeline process and dispersed the money earlier in the year. So we got it at a very needed time. And then we were provided with new grants I think what's important to note is with revised application processes that made everything a lot more simple to get money, and then the turnaround for receiving that money was quick. We also were able to apply to the federal government for PPE funds through the CARES Act, and we just received our forgiveness for those funds just this week. We are really grateful for all of the support since it was challenging to continue with our noble fundraising models during the pandemic. But unfortunately, despite all of this, we still raised 25% less than the previous year. And so we have felt an adverse impact due to COVID. And the question that we were thinking and that we have at our organization is, when the pandemic or when shelter in place hit back in March, there was a ton of response very quickly to the orders. But now we've been feeling that the momentum has dwindled a bit, and we're not really seeing the same response in 2021 that we saw last year. We felt it's become a little bit more challenging to procure funding. And what we've been asking for is we've received a lot less, or we see somewhat less. So based on that, and knowing that COVID-19 is going to be with us and not going away anytime soon, meaning that we're not able to rely on, those old fundraising models of in-person events, can you both, and you spoke about this briefly, but I'm wondering if you could both elaborate on the long-term resources or response initiatives in 2021 that continue the spirit of urgency that was established last March? Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I'll be really brief and kind of to Stephanie, because I know I think we're getting close to time. But you know, I think this is kind of one of the most important questions for all of us to grapple with. Is, you know, there was a crisis, people responded, the donors, like, you know, really stepped up, and we got a lot of, as a community foundation, a lot of our donors really came forward, and the crisis hasn't gone away, and it's not going away for a while. And so I hear you. I think that the urgency, we have to figure out a way to keep the urgency and also look at the long-term, you know, economic recovery. And this is part of, I think, Heather's question about, you know, what's happening to the other funding that funders were already putting out there. And so the question for us as folks working in philanthropy is like, how do you hold steady, not abandon the incredible work that we are already supporting, because that need hasn't gone away. In fact, they need the resources more than ever, and step up to the crisis. And I think that's a really tough question. I think we should grapple with it. Some foundations I mentioned, we're increasing our payout for the next few years as one way to do that. I think you've seen a lot of national foundations really take a hard look at their endowments and say, like, we could do more. And so that is, to be honest with you, I think one of the mechanisms we can all look at within our own foundations. And also that's the benefit of staying connected to community, is you hold us accountable to say, hey, the need is not going away. It's still there. But Stephanie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I would say, you know, like SF Foundation, Haas has committed another several million above our typical grant making for 2021. Part of that is for COVID, and part of that is for kind of like supporting democracy. And I think, you know, the work that ING does, it comes into relief even more. I think funders recognize that bringing communities together, even if you're not a direct service group that's feeding people, that you play such a critical role in the fabric of our democracy, which has been so frayed over the last years and just past few weeks. So I do think that there's, and Maha is not shy at all, who was the former ED of ING, is not shy about asking for money, which I think is absolutely great, because there should not be shyness. Our job is to give away money. It is absolutely important in every conversation with a funder to ask. Like, I'm actually surprised sometimes I will talk with folks or meet with folks and they don't ask about grants. So I think you should always feel emboldened to ask funders. It's what we do, and we should be asked. And as Elena said earlier to another question, like relying on your committed funders, Haas has been with you guys for a long time. Like, if we can open doors, that's part of what we'd like to do.
Thank you, and thank you all. This has been a very rich conversation, and just a reminder, the recording link as well as Stephanie's slide will be sent out to our 5,000 e-subscribers by day's end today. We hope that this conversation has also demystified and inspired others who are on the call to seek out funding in this fragile time. We want to thank Elena and Stephanie, as well as Reverend Butler, Heather, and Ishak for their incredible presentations today. As we're saying thank you, I'd be remiss if I did not thank the program associate and administrative associate for the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Cynthia Zambucas, as well as our amazing COVID Command Center, Joint Information Center virtual outreach team, John McKnight, who is on the call with us, the Community Partners Group Coordinator, Trey Russell Allen, who's the coordinator of the virtual outreach team, Elise Karawala, our amazing producer, and Sharon Walton, our amazing lead. We look forward to being together again next week when we will hear from the San Francisco Department of the Environment. And they're going to brief us on measures being taken to update the city's climate action plan in these times of COVID. That concludes our program today. Again, thank you to our participants, and we look forward to seeing you next week.